r/NoSleep. Posted by u/HerScreams. I met my soulmate in Shanghai. I wish I hadn't. I arrived in Shanghai under a haze of jet lag and grief. The city's chaotic energy did little to ease the numbness that had settled in my bones. I hadn't returned to China since I was a child, and even then, it was a fleeting visit, a brief encounter with distant relatives I never thought I'd see again. Now, I was back to settle in a state that felt more like a burden than a gift. The death of my uncle, a man I barely knew, had summoned me here. I had only vague memories of him from my childhood, blurry images of a quiet man standing at the edge of family gatherings. When I was contacted by the lawyer handling his estate, the news didn't hit me with the shock one might expect. Instead, it felt like a summons, an obligation to a man whose life had been a mystery to me. Still, I accepted out of duty more than curiosity, and now found myself in the heart of a city that thrived on life, while I felt nothing but the weight of death. After dealing with the legal formalities, I wandered through the neon-lit streets, the skyscrapers towering above me, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers in the night. The lawyer had been distant, dismissive even, handing me the keys to the old family property with little more than a formal nod. "It's all in your hands now," he had said, and the words echoed in my mind, heavy with implication. What did he mean by that? I found myself by the river, watching the lights from the Bund reflect on the water. The city hummed with life around me, but it felt as though I was drifting, disconnected, a stranger in my own family's history. That's when I saw him. He stood casually by the railing, his silhouette illuminated by the glow of the skyline. There was something about him that caught my attention immediately. Perhaps it was the way he stood, confident yet reserved, or the way his eyes flickered toward me before I had even realized I was staring. He didn't belong to the crowd, that much was clear. He seemed separate, like a fragment of the night itself. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" His voice was smooth, almost melodic, breaking through the ambient noise of the city. There was a warmth in his tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise, an unsettling, magnetic pull. I hesitated for a moment before responding. "It is," I said softly, unsure why I was suddenly nervous. His gaze was intense, almost too intense, but there was an undeniable charm in his smile. I found myself drawn to him, feeling a spark of something I hadn't felt since I'd arrived, a connection in a place that had so far made me feel utterly alone. "Lei." He introduced himself, holding out a hand. His grip was firm but cold, a subtle chill that lingered even after he released it. We fell into an easy conversation as we walked along the riverside, the lights of the city shimmering on the surface of the water beside us. Lei was charismatic, attentive in a way that made me forget, if only for a moment, why I was even in Shanghai. He asked about me, about my life, but deflected when I asked about his. Mysterious, I thought. Maybe a little too mysterious, but I was intrigued. After all, what harm was there in a little distraction from the heaviness of death? By the time we parted ways, exchanging numbers, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since I'd arrived, I wasn't alone. But as I made my way back to the sleek, modern apartment I was renting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lei had been watching me long before I had noticed him. The following days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. The estate had more complications than I expected, deeds, assets, and family relics I had never heard of. Each conversation with the lawyer brought new surprises, like my uncle's ownership of an old house tucked away in one of Shanghai's forgotten districts. The thought of going there alone made me uneasy, so I kept putting it off. Something about the way the lawyer had brushed off questions about the house felt wrong, as though he didn't want to talk about it. But in between the stress, there was Lei. We had been seeing each other almost every day. Dinners, late-night walks, and quiet conversations in quiet cafes. It was easy to get lost in his charm, his ease of conversation, the way he seemed to understand everything without me having to explain. Still, I couldn't help but feel there was something he wasn't telling me, something just beneath the surface. He would smile, but sometimes the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. One night, after a particularly grueling day dealing with the estate, Lei invited me to his apartment. The invitation felt natural, a progression in what had quickly become a relationship. His apartment was on the outskirts of the city, in a high-rise that seemed out of place among the old neighborhoods it towered over. The interior was modern, sleek, and spotless. Yet it felt sterile. There were no personal touches, no photos or signs of a life lived. Just perfect, polished surfaces. "You must be exhausted," Lei said, as he poured me a glass of wine. I nodded, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The warmth of the wine helped a little, but the coldness of the apartment clung to me. As we sat together on his pristine couch, I couldn't help but notice how still he was. Too still. His movements, usually smooth and graceful, now seemed rehearsed, like each gesture was part of an intricate performance. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. A crack. It was small, barely noticeable, but it ran along the edge of his jawline. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I blinked, it was gone, as if it had never been there. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to ask him, to say something, but the words died before they left my lips. I stared at my wine glass instead, forcing myself to relax, to ignore what I had just seen. "Is something wrong?" Lay's voice cut through my thoughts, soft but probing. I shook my head quickly, plastering on a smile. "No, I'm just tired." He watched me for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable, before nodding. "Of course. It's been a long week for you." His hand touched mine, cold against my skin, and for a second, I could swear I felt that same crack beneath his fingers. A chill raced through me, but I said nothing. The days that followed should have felt normal, but nothing did. My work with the estate became an afterthought, replaced by an obsession I couldn't shake. Lay. Something about him knotted my mind, filling every quiet moment with unease. I kept replaying that night in his apartment, convincing myself that the crack I'd seen was just a trick of my exhausted mind. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the worse the feeling became. It wasn't just that. He was changing, or at least, my perception of him was. Small things, barely noticeable at first. His voice would sometimes sound too smooth, almost unnatural. His movements, always so graceful, seemed too deliberate, like they were mimicked rather than natural. And the dreams. They started shortly after that night in his apartment. In the first dream, I was standing at the foot of Lay's bed. He was lying there, asleep, but something was wrong. His face was smooth and flawless as always, but then, slowly, the skin began to peel away. It didn't bleed, and there was no pain, just layers of flesh slipping off, revealing something hideous underneath. A twisted, contorted face with hollow eyes that stared back at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the sheets tangled around me. It was just a dream, I told myself, over and over again. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia. Every time I met with Lay, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me too closely, studying me. And the crack I'd seen that night? It started appearing more often. Sometimes it was on his jaw, sometimes his hands. Each time it would disappear before I could get a second look, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. One afternoon, I decided it was finally time to visit my uncle's old house. The place had been left untouched for years, gathering dust and sinking into disrepair. The lawyer's vague descriptions and dismissiveness had only fueled my curiosity. I had been avoiding it, reluctant to confront whatever history might be buried there, but the weight of uncertainty was starting to suffocate me. The house stood at the end of a narrow street, hidden among overgrown trees and faded stone walls. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern apartment I had been staying in. Everything about this place felt old, forgotten, like it belonged to a different era altogether. I pushed open the creaking door, a rush of stale air hitting me as I stepped inside. I spent hours going through piles of papers, yellowed books, and fading family mementos. My uncle's life was scattered across the rooms, half forgotten, and for a while, it felt like I was drowning in someone else's memories. The deeper I dug, the more disoriented I became. Dusty photographs, letters written in fading ink, items that seemed to have no connection to me at all. At the bottom of a worn leather box, buried beneath stacks of old papers, was an old photograph. The paper was fragile, worn around the edges, but it was the faces in the picture that sent a chill through me. I stared at the image, two men standing side by side. One of them I recognized immediately as my great-uncle, though he was much younger in the picture. But it was the man beside him that made my skin crawl. It was Lay. The photograph had to be at least 60 years old, judging by the way the men were dressed. Yet Lay looked exactly the same as he did now. His face was unchanged, smooth, flawless, and unaged. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest, my hands trembling as I held the picture closer to examine it. No one could look the same after all this time. I flipped the photograph over, hoping for some explanation, but the back was blank. No dates, no names, nothing that could tell me who these men were to each other or why this picture existed. A wave of nausea rolled through me. It wasn't just Lay's unnerving perfection anymore. There was something far darker at play here, something that had been lurking in the shadows of my family long before I arrived in Shanghai. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave. I shoved the photograph into my bag and rushed out of the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. As I walked back to the apartment, the city's noise became distant, muffled by the thoughts crashing through my mind. Lei wasn't human. He couldn't be. The photograph was proof that he had existed far longer than any normal person should. But why? And why was he here, now, in my life? The questions spun wildly in my head, but no answers came. I felt a growing sense of dread, as if the world around me was closing in. That night, I lay awake in bed, the photograph resting on the table beside me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lei's face, his perfect, unchanging face, and the crack I had seen on his skin. The next morning, I woke up feeling heavy, as though the weight of the photograph had settled deep inside my chest, squeezing my lungs. I hadn't slept well. Every creak in the apartment made me bolt upright, expecting to find Lei standing in the shadows, watching me. The rational part of my brain kept trying to soothe me, to tell me that I was overreacting, but the photograph on the table beside me said otherwise. I couldn't just ignore it. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure how to get them. Who could I even trust at this point? I decided to meet Lei later that day. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet, but I needed to see him. I needed to figure out if there was any part of this man that was still normal, still human. Maybe I could find a crack in the facade that would explain all of this. Or maybe I was walking straight into a trap. When he greeted me outside a cafe, his smile was just as flawless as it always had been. But now, I couldn't unsee the truth. I couldn't shake the image of the photograph, the knowledge that he had been standing beside my great-uncle, looking exactly the same as he did now. How long had he been hiding this? And why? "You seem distant today," Lei said, his eyes narrowing slightly as we sat down. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, fighting the growing panic in my chest. "Yeah, just. Didn't sleep too well last night." He studied me carefully, too carefully, as if he knew I was hiding something. There was something in his gaze that I hadn't noticed before, something calculating and cold. I could feel my pulse racing, the walls of the cafe closing in around me. I needed to leave. But before I could excuse myself, Lei's hand reached across the table, resting lightly on mine. His touch, once so warm and reassuring, now felt like ice. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice too smooth, too controlled. Distracted. I swallowed hard, trying to pull my hand away, but his grip tightened. I yanked my hand free, my heart pounding in my chest. I need to go." Lei's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. He knew. He knew I had seen something, and now there was no going back. I left the cafe in a rush, not daring to look back. My hands were trembling as I hurried down the street, my mind racing. I needed to figure out what I was dealing with, but who could help me? The police? No, they'd think I was insane. My friends? They were thousands of miles away, and besides, they wouldn't understand. No one would. Except maybe the lawyer. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. He had been so dismissive, so eager to hand off my uncle's estate and wash his hands of it. But now that I thought about it, there had been something strange about the way he avoided answering my questions about my family's past. Maybe he knew more than he let on. Maybe he could help me understand what was happening. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my fingers shaking as I pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" His voice crackled through the line, sharp and impatient. "It's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you. It's about my uncle. Something really strange is going on." There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more measured. "Meet me at my office. We'll talk." I hung up, a knot of anxiety twisting in my gut. The way he had said it, "we'll talk," felt loaded with meaning. He knew something. I could feel it. The lawyer's office was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The building was unremarkable, with peeling paint and a small sign that looked like it hadn't been changed in years. I wasn't sure why I had come here, but my instincts told me this was my only lead. If anyone could give me answers about my uncle's strange past, it would be Mr. Feng. I stepped inside, the musty smell of old paper and dust greeting me. He sat behind his desk, his sharp eyes flicking up from a stack of documents as I entered. "I thought you were done with the estate," he muttered, setting his papers aside. I shook my head, suddenly unsure how to begin. It's not about the estate. I've found something. Something strange. He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to curiosity. Go on. I hesitated, pulling the photograph from my bag and sliding it across the desk. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he examined the faded image of my great-uncle and Lei standing together, decades ago. This photo. It's old, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But the man in it. He hasn't aged. That's Lei. The same man I've been seeing for the past few weeks. He looks exactly the same. Mr. Feng's face paled as his fingers tightened around the photograph. He stared at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. In my uncle's house, I replied. I was going through his things and I don't know. I can't explain it. But something about Lei. There's something wrong with him. He sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. He seemed older now, more worn down than when I had first met him. I had hoped this wouldn't happen, he muttered to himself. Then, louder, your uncle was involved in something. Something he didn't want to talk about. I leaned forward. What do you mean? What was he involved in? He stood up, pacing behind his desk. Your family has been in Shanghai for generations. There are old stories, legends about strange things happening to people connected to your bloodline. Disappearances, sightings, people aging too quickly or not at all. I thought it was just nonsense, superstitions passed down through the years. But when I saw your uncle's estate and how quickly he wanted it all handled, I suspected something else. He paused, glancing at the photograph again. But this is proof. My mouth went dry. Proof of what? Proof that whatever your uncle was trying to escape has come back. And now it's after you. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. Lei isn't. He's not human, is he? Mr. Feng didn't answer right away. He seemed to struggle with the words, finally saying, there's an old legend, one that speaks of creatures that can take the form of humans. They use their appearance to deceive, to lure people in. These creatures, these painted skin demons, have been around for centuries, feeding on those they can trap. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my vision blurring as the reality of what he was saying set in. And you think Lei is one of them? He nodded grimly. I'm almost certain. Your uncle tried to run from this, but he wasn't fast enough. You need to leave Shanghai. Now. I stood up, my legs shaky. But how? How do I stop him? How do I get away? He looked at me with pity in his eyes. I don't know if you can. But you need to try. I left Mr. Feng's office with a cold knot of fear in my stomach. The streets outside were busy as always, but everything felt distant, muffled, like I was moving through a dream I couldn't wake up from. The world around me no longer felt real. Nothing did. My mind raced as I hurried back to my apartment. Mr. Feng's words echoed in my head, each one tightening the noose of dread around my chest. Painted skin demon. The idea sounded ridiculous, something pulled straight out of a horror movie. But the photograph, Lei. I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I had seen it with my own eyes. I had felt it in my gut. Lei wasn't human, and now I was part of whatever dark game he was playing. I fumbled with the keys to my apartment, my hands shaking as I let myself inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it quickly, as if the flimsy bolt could keep something like him out. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. I moved to the window, pulling the curtains shut, trying to block out the city beyond. For the first time since I'd arrived in Shanghai, I felt trapped, cornered by something I didn't understand. I needed to leave. Mr. Feng was right, there was no point in trying to confront Lei. I had to get as far away from him as possible. My flight back to the United States wasn't scheduled for another week, but I couldn't wait that long. I had to find a way out now. I packed quickly, throwing my belongings into my suitcase with shaking hands. As I zipped up the bag, my phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message from Lei. Dinner tonight? I miss you. My heart lurched in my chest. The words were innocent, casual even, but now they sent a jolt of terror through me. He knew. He had to know. Why else would he reach out now, after everything? I stared at the message, my hands cold and clammy, before forcing myself to respond. I'm not feeling well. Maybe another time. I set the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. I didn't have much time. I needed to book a flight, get out of the apartment, and disappear before Lay realized what I was doing. I was about to start searching for flights when the phone buzzed again. Another message. I can come over. Take care of you. I dropped the phone, my pulse spiking. He was too close, too eager. I had to move. Now. I grabbed my suitcase and darted toward the door. Just as I reached for the handle, there was a knock. 3 sharp raps echoed through the apartment like a death knell. "Hey! It's me." Lay's voice. I stumbled back from the door, my mind spinning. How had he gotten here so fast? I hadn't even told him where I lived, had I? Panic surged through me as the knocking came again, louder this time. "Are you in there?" Lay's voice was smooth, calm, but there was an edge to it now, something that made my skin crawl. "You didn't answer my message." I clutched my suitcase, my back pressed against the far wall of the apartment. I could hear him moving outside the door, his footsteps slow, deliberate, like he was waiting for something. "I know you're in there," he said softly, almost playfully now. "Don't you want to see me?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming for me to stay silent, to keep as far away from the door as possible. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. My eyes darted around the apartment, searching for an escape. The fire escape. My window led to the back of the building, where the fire escape ladder could take me down to the alley below. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only chance I had. I moved as quietly as I could, tiptoeing toward the window. I slid it open slowly, wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. Just as I was about to climb out, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "Where do you think you're going?" My stomach twisted. I looked down at the phone in horror. There was no way he could have known. Unless he could see me. I didn't have time to think. I clambered out the window, gripping the cold metal of the fire escape as I hurried down the ladder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The alley was dark and narrow, the shadows thick between the buildings. I hit the ground running, my suitcase dragging behind me as I raced toward the street. I didn't know where I was going, all I knew was that I needed to get away. The city felt like a maze, the streets twisting and turning, leading me nowhere. My mind was racing, a jumble of fear and panic that blurred the world around me. I had no plan, no clear destination. I just kept running, hoping that the distance would be enough to keep him away. But it wasn't long before I realized that something was wrong. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many streets I crossed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lay was still close. Too close. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw him, just a flicker of movement in the crowd, a face too familiar among the strangers passing by. I ducked into a nearby cafe, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I couldn't keep running like this. I needed to get out of Shanghai, and fast. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for him to find me. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through flights. There was a late-night flight leaving for the United States in a few hours. It was expensive, but I didn't care. I booked it without thinking, my hands trembling as I entered my payment details. For a moment, I allowed myself to exhale, feeling the tension in my body loosen just a little. The cafe was quiet, a small bubble of normalcy amid the chaos that had consumed my life. The low hum of conversations and the clinking of coffee cups gave me a false sense of comfort. I looked around. No sign of Lay. He wasn't here. Not now. I slid further into the booth, my legs trembling beneath the table. The adrenaline that had been keeping me on my feet for hours was starting to wear off, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I had barely slept in days, and now that I was sitting still, the weight of everything was crashing down on me. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every nerve in my body told me to stay alert, to keep moving, but I couldn't anymore. Just for a moment, I told myself. Just a moment to close my eyes and breathe. I must have only intended to rest for a minute or two, but exhaustion claimed me completely. I don't know how long I had been asleep, maybe an hour, maybe less, but when I woke, the cafe felt different. The air was thick, stifling, and there was a strange silence that hung heavy in the room. I was still winking the sleep away when suddenly, the screen lit up with a new message. "You can't hide from me." A cold wave of terror crashed over me, snapping me out of my drowsy haze. I had fallen asleep. I had let my guard down, and now he was here. Or close. I shoved my phone into my bag and bolted for the door. I burst onto the street, my pulse racing as I frantically scanned the crowd for any sign of Lei. Every shadow, every figure felt like a threat, like he was lurking just out of view. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. Watching. Waiting. I waved down the first taxi I saw, nearly tripping over myself as I climbed into the back seat. The driver barely glanced at me as I gave him the address for the airport, my voice shaky and strained. He pulled away from the curb, the hum of the engine a faint comfort as the city began to blur past the windows. I gripped the edge of the seat, trying to steady my breathing. The flight was booked, and I had a few hours left to make it to the airport. All I had to do was get on that plane. Once I was in the air, once I left Shanghai, I'd be free. At least, that's what I told myself. But the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach refused to fade. Lei had found me so easily before. How had he known I was in the cafe? How had he always been one step ahead? The taxi began slowing down. I glanced up and I saw a pair of red taillights ahead, blinking in the dark. There was a construction vehicle blocking the road, a detour sign flashing in the dim light. The driver sighed, pulling the car to a stop. "Looks like we'll have to take a different route," he muttered, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, but something felt off. The street was too quiet, the shadows too thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that Lei was still close, no matter how fast I tried to escape. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence. I gasped as the passenger window exploded inward, glass raining down like shards of ice. My heart seized in my chest as I turned to see him, Lei. His hand gripping the edge of the broken window, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He moved too fast, too silent, like a predator that had been lurking in the shadows all along. His hand lunged through the window, reaching for me with terrifying speed. His fingers grazed my arm, cold and unyielding. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my throat, but his grip was like iron, tightening around my wrist. He pulled harder, his strength inhuman, dragging me toward the shattered window, shards of glass cutting into my skin. "You're not leaving," he growled, his voice low and menacing, sending a chill down my spine. "You'll never leave me." The driver let out a panicked shout, and the car lurched forward with a screech of tires. The sudden momentum ripped Lei's grip from my wrist and sent him crashing to the ground with brutal force. The driver swore loudly, the air thick with panic. I dared a glance over my shoulder, terrified of what I might see. In the middle of the road, Lei rose slowly to his feet, his movements unnaturally fluid. His head tilted slightly, his eyes locked on the taxi, and a twisted smile crept across his face. "Go. Please." I screamed, my voice cracking as I whipped back toward the driver. The driver, pale and wide-eyed, nodded frantically, slamming his foot down on the gas pedal. The moment the taxi pulled up to the airport, a wave of relief washed over me. I was almost there, just a few steps away from leaving Shanghai, from leaving Lei behind. The terminal was busy, packed with travelers hurrying to their gates, dragging luggage and speaking in rapid-fire conversations that blurred together. It was also normal, so ordinary, that for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. I just had to make it through. Dragging my suitcase behind me, I made my way through the throngs of people. I glanced at the departures board, my eyes darting to the flight that would take me back to Houston. I made my way directly to the boarding gate, and just nearby, I spotted a restroom. Needing a moment to collect myself, I headed into the women's restroom, eager for a brief escape before boarding. The room was silent and empty, the cold fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Setting my bag down, I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to wash away the fear that clung to me like a shadow. For a moment, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Just a few more minutes. I'll be in the air, away from all of this. But when I opened my eyes, everything changed. Standing behind me in the mirror, Lei's reflection filled the space just inches away. His eyes, those cold, dark eyes, burned with something far more sinister than before. My heart seized in my chest as I spun around, but before I could scream, he lunged at me, his hand wrapping around my throat. My breath hitched as his cold fingers closed tightly, squeezing the air from my lungs. Before I could fight back, he lifted me off the ground as if I weighed nothing, his hand tightening around my neck. My feet dangled uselessly in the air, kicking wildly as panic flooded through me. The cold, tiled floor below seemed to stretch away, the world blurring around the edges of my vision. I clawed at his hand, my nails digging into his skin, but it didn't matter. His grip didn't loosen. He held me effortlessly, his dark eyes watching me with that same eerie calm, as if this were all part of some twisted game. My chest burned, desperate for air. I gasped, but nothing came. My pulse pounded in my ears, and black spots danced at the corners of my vision. The pressure on my throat was unbearable. Every second, it grew tighter, crushing me from the inside out. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You really thought you could get away from me?" My mind raced, desperate for a way out, for anything that could save me. But the bathroom was empty, and his grip was relentless. Then, the door swung open. A security guard stepped inside, his expression turning to confusion as he saw Leigh in the women's restroom. "Hey!" he called out, stepping forward. "Let go of her." Leigh didn't even flinch. His grip loosened on my neck for just a second, but it was enough for me to gasp for air, my body shaking with terror. The guard reached for Leigh, trying to pull him away from me, but Leigh moved too quickly. He turned on the guard, shoving him backward with a force that sent him crashing to the floor. They struggled, the guard trying to fight back, but Leigh was too strong, too fast. Leigh grabbed the guard by the collar and slammed him against the wall with a brutal strength I hadn't fully understood until now. But in that moment, I saw my chance. Without thinking, I ran toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. I pushed it open and stumbled out into the busy terminal, gasping for air as I ran toward the gate. The terminal was crowded, a sea of people rushing toward their gates. I ducked into the flow of bodies, weaving through the mass of travelers. I could still hear the sounds of the struggle behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I had to reach the gate. I had to get on that plane. I could feel Leigh's presence behind me, even if he wasn't there. His voice still echoed in my mind, his hands still wrapped around my throat. When I reached the gate, it was already boarding. The crowd of passengers offered me the cover I needed. I merged into the line, keeping my head down, my hands shaking as I handed my ticket to the agent. She smiled and waved me through, unaware of the terror that had been stalking me for days. I stepped onto the plane, the cool, pressurized air hitting me like a wave. Rows of seats stretched out in front of me, passengers already settled, tucking bags into overhead compartments and chatting quietly. I moved through the aisle like a ghost, my mind still racing, scanning every face for any sign of Leigh. But he wasn't here. Not anymore. I found my seat near the back of the plane, squeezing past a woman engrossed in her book, her headphones firmly in place. I sank into the window seat, my hands shaking as I buckled the seatbelt. The hum of the engines below was a faint comfort, something steady in the chaos. The pit in my stomach tightened as the plane gathered speed, racing faster and faster down the runway. My fingers gripped the armrests, the tension rising with every passing second. I stared out the window, watching as the ground blurred beneath us, the airport shrinking away as the nose of the plane lifted into the sky. I had escaped. Or so I thought. As I sat there, staring out the window, I felt a strange tingling in my hand. I looked down, and my blood froze. There, on the inside of my palm, was a mark, faint, barely visible, but undeniably there. A thin crack, like the ones I had seen on Leigh's skin, ran across the surface of my hand. It was as if a part of him had stayed with me, even now, even after I had escaped. I clenched my fist, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. I had made it onto the plane. I was leaving Shanghai. But I knew, deep down, that I hadn't truly escaped him. I could still feel his presence. Watching. Waiting.